So I'm sure you've heard the news by now. Donald Trump wins.
He'll return to the White House as this country's 47th president.
One of his biggest boosters, billionaire Elon Musk.
And making a political comeback unlike any in modern American politics.
Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy?
Claiming victory.
Frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. We're going to fix our borders. We're going to fix everything about our country.
Now, I don't want you to panic, but these are important things that Canadians better know regarding how Donald Trump's policies and mannerisms and becoming president of the US may affect Canada. So Donald Trump just beat out Kamala Harris and is re-elected as the next US president. Now, you're not alone if you instantly start wondering as a Canadian, okay, but what does this mean for Canada? How is this going to affect us? And you start to get a little bit nervous and unsure. How could this impact my finances and bottom line? I'll go through all of that in this video. So there are two common sentiments among Canadians. The first is worry and anxiety, because we're already having economy problems. We have a shrinking GDP per capita, we have cost of living, housing crisis, we're not being as productive as usual. So how will Trump coming into office, being the 47th president, affect Canada and our economy? Two, and this is more subjective, but because Trump just appears to be more assertive, robust, and not as much of a pushover. Whereas Trudeau often seems more wishy-washy, indecisive, and downplays his mistakes. Just look at his flip-flop on immigration.
We didn't get the balance quite right.
So there's a worry that Trump could start to push around Trudeau as America's economy is much larger than Canada's. The second thing I'm hearing all over social media is, okay, one down, one to go. Many people want Trudeau out and are speculating that Trudeau will be gone probably by the next election. Even Elon Musk is tweeting out his thoughts on the matter. So regarding Trump's election, what exactly are the major impacts to Canada and how will this affect us? Let's dive into it. Now, a quick disclaimer, all of this is just a guess, hearsay, my opinion based on fact and research, but no one can say for sure, as no one knows what Donald Trump may or may not actually do. The thing to remember is, don't panic and get worried, as it's out of our control. And America, well, they're nice people. However, they do tend to favor the American side and putting their country first. And as Canada, their biggest trading partner, well, we're going to have a fallout or impact from whatever decisions they choose to implement. Hey, do me a favor. If you're getting something out of this video,
hit the like button, please.
Thanks. Now, of course, this isn't Trump's first time into office, so he's more familiar with what to expect, the issues. He has more experience under his belt. It's also been established that Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau have, we'll call it friction, with Donald Trump, as Donald Trump has referred to having problems with Canadian negotiators. Even though he didn't expressly state outright who the issues were with, it's kind of inferred.
There were no kind words from Donald Trump yesterday when he lashed out at Chrystia Freeland without using her name.
We're very unhappy with the negotiations and the negotiating style of Canada. We don't like their representative very much.
Eventually, both sides dropped the tariffs, but this time, don't expect the same treatment from Canada's largest trading partner.
We understand that the agenda is America first, which means no friends, no allies.
Friends is not how you describe Trudeau and Trump.
Let's face it, the two leaders don't have a great relationship. And I think that could have an impact.
That it's kind of insulting.
After hearing that comment at the conclusion of the G7 summit in Quebec 6 years ago, Trump unleashed a Twitter tirade at Trudeau, calling him meek and mild.
But Canada treated us badly. 287% tariff. Can you believe that?
Now, one of the major changes that I'm sure you've heard about is Donald Trump proposing changes to immigration. And a lot of people are going to be leaving the US, and some of them are going to be trying to cross into Canada, whether legally or illegally, some as asylum seekers. Now, this is something Canada is totally unprepared for, given our population increase over the last 2 years alone. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Aaron, a 20-year corporate accountant and analyst living in Western Canada. I talk about personal finance, investing, the downfall of Canada, and things that affect the middle and working class. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, consider subscribing to my channel.
Donald Trump is promising to deport 11 million undocumented people from the United States. Givens says Canada could expect more people trying to come here, both legally and illegally.
In 2017, Canada had about 20,000 people crossing illegally, mostly at Roxham Road. We are currently at 44,000 a year for people traveling to this country and still claiming asylum, even with the drop in immigration applications such as international students and immigration restrictions that have just been imposed. However, will the Liberal government play the political game and let these people in, or turn them away politely? Who knows? Now, it's no secret that Donald Trump is famous for his Make America Great Again, right? Make it strong, robust. So every time the US economy strengthens and its dollar gets stronger, it weakens our Canadian dollar and the purchasing power of it. So what does this mean for you? Well, with a weakening Canadian dollar, it raises the prices on imported goods that we bring in from the US.
This includes things like electronics, clothing, and even some groceries. And because Canada relies heavily on the US for imports, you could see higher prices at the store, which would hit lower income Canadians especially hard, as they tend to spend a higher proportion of their income on essentials.
Canada and the US are each other's biggest trading partner, with similar economic structures, so it's no wonder why their economies are usually so in sync. However, right now, they are diverging, which is unusual. Canada's economy, high bond yields in the US make it more attractive for investors, which is one of the reasons why the US dollar is likely to strengthen against the Canadian dollar. Major banks are predicting that the USD-CAD exchange rate could reach $1.45 soon, meaning the US dollar would be 3% stronger than it is now. While this may sound like a small percentage, it's a big move for an exchange rate, especially when Canada's inflation target is only 2%. If policies continue to push a strong US dollar, we could see inflation rise even further in Canada. The Bank of Canada was just recently able to bring inflation under control, dropping it down to between 2 or 3%, where they usually like to keep it. However, we're still in a housing and cost of living crisis, so I think many Canadians don't want to see inflation rise any more than it has in previous years. We want to keep it at that low level. However, it's dependent on what the US chooses to do, the strength of their dollar, and the interest rates that they tend to implement. Trump is known for his protective stance on trade, making sure that he looks after America first. So what does this mean for Canada? There might be disruptions in supply chains throughout the world, but at this point it's speculative to say what the impact on Canada would be. For Canadian businesses, this could mean reduced access to US markets, potentially lower sales, and even layoffs. And when businesses start laying off workers, it can lead to unemployment, low consumer spending, and an overall economic slowdown.
American companies importing goods from Canada, as an example, would have to pay the US government a tax of at least 10% of the value of what they bring in, driving prices up for US consumers, and in Trump's view, making American businesses more competitive.
In particular, sectors like manufacturing, agriculture, and energy could feel the pinch, impacting thousands of middle-class jobs.
Favorite word. Tariff!
Trump is also threatening to levy a minimum 10% tariff on all imports. While the president-elect is known to exaggerate, just the threat of trade action could be a problem for Canadian businesses.
Canada's really going to take a hit.
Prime Minister Trudeau's point person on the U.S. says Canada is ready for whatever comes its way.
The team in place has the experience and the expertise and the relationships to make sure that we can promote Canada and defend our interests.
Canada's ambassador to the U.S. insists Trump and Trudeau get along well. That goodwill could help smooth over some of the irritants, she says.
If Trump imposed a 10% tariff on goods exported from Canada into the U.S. because they're our largest trading partner, Canada would be in a recession, like no question about it. Just a 10% tariff, some people are saying, that would almost immediately land us into a recession. Will Trump actually do this and impose such a high tariff on goods? It's anyone's guess at this point. A 10% tariff on all American imports would shrink the Canadian economy, resulting in around $30 billion per year in economic costs. Here's the predicted GDP growth for Canada over the next 3 years. And here you'll see the anticipated growth if those tariffs are imposed on Canada. Quite a difference. more than 77% of Canadian exports go to the US. And it's consumers who will ultimately feel the burden of any inflationary effect caused by broad tariffs. Just look at car manufacturing here in Canada. Approximately 85% of those cars are exported to the US. A 10% tariff on just those cars alone would drastically increase the manufacturing costs here in Canada. In some cases, a 200% tariff on cars might be implemented. However, remember, it is unknown at this point if Donald Trump will impose a universal tariff for every country, only on specific countries, or only on specific products from certain countries. Trump uses tariffs as a means to control and encourage American products and position the US into a strong position for negotiations. Don't forget, Trump did co-write The Art of the Deal, published in 1987. If we're talking about books, he did also write The Art of the Comeback, published in 1997. He would know. So are Canada and the US going to work together and be Team North America? Or is it going to be a repeat of what happened just a few years ago with that big controversy in which Canada accepted imports of steel and aluminum from China, then they polished it up and shipped it down to the US saying it's a Canadian product, until Trump said no more of that. And it wasn't until the day after the tariffs were imposed that our Liberal government sat up and said, okay, let's try to work something out here. Ultimately, it would be best for both countries if no tariffs were imposed on each other's imports and exports, as it would just be passing the costs along to the consumers.
People are predicting that mortgage rates will be going down and that housing values such as in the GTA are going to be going up. However, this doesn't take into account that unemployment has been creeping up in Canada and is at 6.5%, pretty much the highest since the COVID pandemic. However, 47,000 jobs were added, but some people are expecting the unemployment rate to keep climbing. Bond rates are also going up, affecting mortgages rates because 5-year bond rates affect mortgage rates.
At least we know that with unemployment rates that high, over 6%, the government wouldn't or shouldn't be bringing in any temporary foreign workers. For Canadians who travel to the US, to get a deal on goods because they're cheaper usually in the US, such as groceries, for example. This will impact your buying power because you'll find your Canadian dollar won't stretch as far. Usually, the economic performance of the Canadian and American economy is pretty parallel and similar. Unfortunately, a divergence is starting to emerge, whereas the US economy is slowly starting to pull away from the lagging Canadian economy. Add to that, their Canadian dollar is getting weaker. If the Trump administration starts tightening border precautions and immigration policies, revisiting them, this could make it tougher for everyday travel for Canadians venturing to the US. For people who often commute to the US, well, it could make the process a lot more complex and complicated, and you might want to consider shopping more local, even though it will probably be more expensive. Donald Trump famously also has a very protectionist, America first mentality, which could trickle over into the energy sector as well. Also, did I forget to mention that I've done accounting for oil and gas companies here in Alberta, so I do know a thing or two about oil and gas and our energy reserves. One primary concern is Trump's proposed 10 to 20% tariff on imports, which could disadvantage Alberta's oil exports to the US, its largest oil market. Alberta exports about 87% of its oil to the US, so any additional costs on these exports would heavily affect the province's economy. Experts like Al Salazar from Enverse worry that such tariffs could force a trade advantage for the US energy companies, causing uncertainty for Alberta's industry. While some, like portfolio manager Eric Nuttall, argue that Trump's policies could drive up oil prices, benefiting Alberta's energy sector, others believe the U.S. reliance on Canadian oil would prevent heavy oil tariffs on energy imports. Nevertheless, trade expert Carlo Dade cautions that Trump's tariff approach could destabilize trade relationships by creating economic pressure to bring jobs back to the U.S., which could harm Alberta. The political landscape since Trump's return has changed. New issues, new influences, notably from Project 2025, creating an unpredictable environment. Analysts like Tija from the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and Alberta's trade officials stress the need for Canada to adapt its trade approach, building strategic relationships with U.S. states and reconsidering how it communicates its economic contributions to the US. Trump has always promoted US oil production, which could lead to lower global oil prices. Low oil prices sound like a good idea, but for Canada, this actually hurts us. Canada is a major exporter of oil, so a drop in global prices reduces revenue from oil exports, which is a major part of the Canadian economy. For workers in Canada's energy sector, lower oil prices can lead to layoffs and budget cuts. And with a large part of Canada's economy tied to oil, lower revenue from oil exports could reduce government revenues, affecting public services that Canadians rely on. Beyond the immediate economic impacts, there are also long-term political impacts that we should also consider. Trump's approach to international relations, especially with allies, can have a destabilizing effect. His willingness to impose tariffs on allies, as we saw during his previous term with aluminum and steel tariffs, could reappear. And if the US economy faces economic turbulence, it's likely to impact Canada, given our close ties. As the US works to strengthen and protect its own economy, Canada may have to learn to become more self-reliant. Countries that belong to NATO are supposed to be spending about 2% of their GDP on defense spending. However, Canada has been trailing for a number of years and is currently only spending around 1.29% every year on defense. Trudeau and the Liberal government have stated a new overall investment of $8.1 billion over the next 5 years and $73 billion over 20 years to bring Canada closer to the 2% expected NATO commitment. However, it is somewhat doubtful if this will satisfy Trump or wear on his patience. Some people believe that if Trump is able to end the war in the Ukraine, this would free up money that Canada would be contributing, usually towards the Ukraine, and could be diverted to that 2% NATO commitment. That way, Canada doesn't have to hit up the Canadian taxpayer. Now, this is just my opinion, but I could see Trump leveraging and leaning on Trudeau and having Trudeau cave on certain issues. Just a thought. But Pierre Poilievre, it would be really interesting to see him in office against Trump. Two strong-willed gentlemen, and I picture they'd either really get along and work together, or they'd be battling it out constantly on two other sides of the spectrum. Like there's no middle ground. I couldn't see it.
Well, like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but...
Like who?
I don't know who, but...
Well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
You must know somebody.
Ideological inclination in terms of taking the page out of Donald Trump's book, but
what are you
also...
talking about? What page? What page? Can you give me a page? Give me the page. You keep saying that.
In terms of turning things quite dramatically, in terms of Trudeau and the left wing and all of this, I mean, you make quite a, it's quite a play that you make on it. So I'm
not
just
sure.
wondering.
I don't know what your question is.
Then forget that. Why should Canadians trust you with their vote?
Common sense. Okay. Common sense for a change. We're going to make common sense common in this country. We don't have any common sense in the current government.
My personal stance on this is I'm going to change very little in my daily routine. I'm not going to let some election or new leader impact my decisions that much, but I don't let it roll over all my decisions. I can't control what happens out there. I can only control what I do with my own finances and practical planning. I could just see that. Like, I'm not going to sit there and worry and wonder and, oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen with my finances? Stay calm. Don't panic. It's just an election. Okay, so he won. Well, good for him. I'm going to keep doing my daily routine. I'm not going to change much about my life. Does anyone still remember that show, The Apprentice? Remember it was on like 15 years ago or something? I actually got kind of a kick out of that show. Like I enjoyed it. I'd always have my favorites, and I don't like her or him, but I hope he wins, or I really like her. She seems cool, it was a pretty good show. It was decent, I thought. I just really hope he doesn't say to Canada, "You're fired." Don't let it rule over your life. It'll be okay. Relax. And if you're interested in more tips on personal finance and investing, consider subscribing to my channel. Like this video if you found it useful and got something out of it. And here's a great video recommended by the YouTube algorithm that I think you'll really enjoy.